Every crime hides a story, and every story leaves a trace.
It was a particularly sullen morning in late October when I found myself once again within the familiar confines of 221 B. Baker Street. The fire crackled against the dreary chill that seeped through the panes, and the aroma of fresh ink and old tobacco mingled with the damp scent of rain off the cobbled streets. Holmes sat in his armchair, enveloped in his dressing gown, legs crossed, his gaze fixed upon a small envelope of thick cream stock that bore neither seal nor insignia. "Something of note?" I asked, hanging my hat and coat on the peg by the door. I had just returned from a morning call at the practice and noted, not without a measure of anticipation, the familiar glint in Holmes's eyes that usually signaled the beginning of a case. He held the envelope between his long fingers as though it might whisper secrets if pressed just so. "A puzzle, Watson," he said at last, "but of the most curious sort. Would you like to hear it?" "By all means." Without further ado, Holmes handed me a neatly folded sheet of paper, typewritten, save for a peculiar ink blot in the lower corner, as though the writer had been abruptly interrupted. The letter read, "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you are doubtless aware of the recent drowning at St. Sed's Bridge, but I assure you, Mr. Holmes, no one crossed it that night. If you believe in puzzles, come to Brierbank Manor before the inquest delivers its final verdict. I will await you. A friend to truth. St. Sed's Bridge," I mused aloud. "I don't recall any mention in the papers." Holmes steepled his fingers. "There was a brief notice in the Daily Telegraph yesterday morning. A young solicitor named Edwin Lavington, recently engaged, was found drowned beneath the bridge. The coroner's preliminary report stated death by misadventure, presumably caused by slipping in the night. Yet this message suggests something quite different. Namely, that no one crossed the bridge." I read the letter again, its deliberate ambiguity unsettling. But surely he must have crossed. How else to explain the body in the river? Holmes stood and walked to the window. Rain misted the glass, casting the gas lamps outside into dim blurs of gold. "Precisely, Watson. A man drowns beneath a bridge, and yet someone claims he never crossed it. That, my dear fellow, is the kind of contradiction that demands inquiry." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a second envelope, this one with the seal of Scotland Yard. "A message just arrived by express," she said. "The inspector asked it be given directly to Mr. Holmes." Holmes opened it with the tip of his penknife, his eyes scanning quickly. "Ah, Lestrade is already involved. He confirms the location. Brierbank Manor is indeed the residence of Sir Hector Blackbriar, former colonial magistrate and noted eccentric. The body of Lavington was recovered at dawn by local constables, and Lestrade himself is en route to oversee the inquest." "Well then," I said, reaching for my coat once more, "shall we join him?" Holmes was already striding toward his bedroom. "Pack lightly, Watson. I suspect this won't be a long visit, but it will, I wager, be a memorable one." By that afternoon, the two of us were aboard a train speeding through the grey drapery of the English countryside. Fog clung low to the fields, and water-coloured shadows flickered across the window panes. Holmes remained silent for the better part of an hour, his fingers tapping soundlessly on the leather seat, lost in thought. Finally, I asked, "Do you know anything of this Sir Hector?" Holmes stirred. "A curious man, once accused of corruption while administering justice in Calcutta, though nothing was proven. Since returning to England, he's lived in semi-retirement, hosting philosophical salons and maintaining a reputation for theatrical tendencies." "Theatrical?" "Indeed. Brierbank Manor is known in certain circles for its elaborate gardens, eccentric guests, and a private library said to house books long banned by clerical authorities." I raised an eyebrow. "A rather gothic atmosphere for a drowning." Holmes smiled faintly. "Quite. And gothic atmospheres often prove fertile ground for murder." We arrived at the village of Grinstead by dusk and took a cab to Brierbank Manor, a looming estate perched on the edge of a wooded cliff. As we approached, the stone arches of St. Sed's Bridge came into view, an old and narrow structure of crumbling masonry spanning a black and sluggish river below. Rain had swollen the waters, and I imagined how easily a man could vanish into such depths. Sir Hector himself greeted us at the door. He was a tall, cadaverous man with thick grey whiskers and an air of amused detachment, as if all of life were a private jest. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, welcome. You've come about poor Edwin, I presume. I suppose someone sent you the note." "Indeed," Holmes said, his eyes scanning the hallway beyond Sir Hector. "May we see the bridge and where the body was found? But of course, though I should warn you, the path is treacherous in this weather. The stones grow slick and the river has moods of its own." We followed him down a winding garden path through dripping hedgerows until we reached the edge of the bridge. Holmes studied it in silence, then crouched, running his fingers along the worn edge of the first stone slab. "No footprints," he muttered, "and no sign of the broken railing the report described." Sir Hector frowned. "It was replaced yesterday. Local workmen thought it best to restore it before the inquest. Country folk are oddly superstitious. There were whispers of ghostly footsteps. Nonsense, of course." Holmes rose. "And yet someone believes no man crossed this bridge the night Lavington died." Sir Hector offered a shrug. "I only know what you do, that the young man dined here, left in high spirits shortly before midnight, and was found the next morning in the river, dead and quite alone." We turned to go, but Holmes lingered, casting one last glance over the mist-shrouded expanse. Then, almost casually, he stooped to retrieve a small object nestled between two stones. He held it up to the waning light. "A button," he said, almost to himself. "A gentleman's waistcoat button, pewter, worn smooth at the edges." And then he smiled, a thin, satisfied smile that boded well for the unraveling of darker threads. Holmes turned the pewter button over in his fingers once more, his expression unreadable in the dusk. He did not speak until we were nearly halfway back to the manor, where the path rose away from the riverside and climbed gently into the cultivated grounds. The drizzle had grown into a persistent mist, soaking through the brims of our hats and turning the path underfoot into a treacherous ribbon of slick stones. "Watson, you'll have noticed, of course, that the button bore traces of rust not from itself, but from contact with something ferrous, perhaps a clasp or hook." I admitted I had noticed nothing of the sort. Holmes gave a slight chuckle. "No shame in that, my dear fellow. Observation is not simply seeing, but noting that which deviates from the expected. Buttons of this sort are not prone to such discoloration unless forced into unnatural situations. And what sort of gentleman loses a waistcoat button in the middle of a stone bridge without a struggle?" Before I could respond, we found ourselves once more at the grand portico of Brierbank Manor, where a servant waited with dry towels and a welcome glass of mulled wine. Holmes refused both, asking instead to be shown to Lavington's quarters. The room, situated on the eastern wing of the manor, was modest by the house's standards. Sparsely furnished, save for a writing desk, a travel trunk, and a bookcase mostly filled with law texts and dull volumes on probate procedure. Holmes moved about the room silently, opening drawers, lifting the edges of rugs, sniffing lightly at a handkerchief folded neatly atop the bureau. His hands paused only once, upon finding a slender gold chain tucked into the drawer's corner, severed cleanly at one end. He held it up. A watch chain, snapped. I leaned in. "You think there was a struggle here?" "Number, but someone took care to remove whatever was once attached. There are no scratches near the clasp. It was cut deliberately. Come now, let us speak with the master of the house again." Sir Hector greeted us in the study, a room as cluttered as it was eccentric. Animal masks from tribal Africa adorned the mantel, and a human skull, lacquered no less, rested atop a stack of Greek tragedies beside the hearth. He poured himself a generous portion of brandy before settling into a high-backed chair. "You have questions, no doubt," he said. Holmes leaned against the fireplace, tapping the severed chain against his palm. "Only one for the moment. Were you present when Mr. Lavington left the manor on the night he died?" Sir Hector raised an eyebrow. "Indeed I was. He excused himself around 11:15. I offered him a carriage, but he declined. Said the air would do him good. A sturdy young man. Had the look of a prize fighter about him. No indication he was troubled or uncertain. Quite the contrary. He appeared in high spirits." "And did anyone else leave the house that night?" Holmes asked, his tone deceptively light. Sir Hector shook his head. "Not to my knowledge. The guests had already retired and the staff were accounted for in their quarters. We run a quiet house, Mr. Holmes. Theatrics aside." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "And yet someone took great pains to retrieve this—" He held up the chain, "from Lavington's room. A souvenir, perhaps, or evidence." Sir Hector's eyes narrowed, but he offered nothing further. Holmes allowed the silence to linger before giving a tight nod and turning toward the door. I followed him, though not without a growing sense of unease. Once in the corridor, Holmes paused and said in a low voice, "The man lies, Watson." "About what?" "About everything, I should imagine. But especially about who left the house that night. I suspect at least one guest departed after Lavington, though they may have returned unseen. The real question is not how Lavington died, but who else knew he would be walking that path alone." Before I could respond, a new voice drifted from the far end of the hall. A woman stood there, silhouetted by lamplight, tall, poised, dressed in mourning black. "I thought you might wish to speak with me," she said softly. I was Edwin's fiancée. We followed her to a smaller parlor, where she introduced herself as Miss Caroline Dorrell. Her face bore the strain of recent grief, but her eyes were clear, watchful. There was nothing faint or feeble in her demeanor. "I came to the manor the morning after," she said. "Sir Hector sent word immediately. I stayed in the village helping arrange the inquest. I knew Edwin well. He would not have wandered off a bridge. He was deliberate in all things, even his footfalls." Holmes nodded approvingly. "You believe he met with foul play?" "I know it," she said. "He had no enemies, not among his clients, but he had recently told me that he was considering withdrawing from Sir Hector's employment, said something here troubled him. I asked what it was. He said only that he had seen something he could not explain and that it left him feeling watched." Holmes turned slightly. "What was the nature of his employment with Sir Hector?" He had been helping with the estate's legal restructuring, taxes, trusteeships, asset declarations, that sort of thing. Edwin said it was mostly routine until it wasn't. Holmes smiled faintly. A vague threat cloaked in civility. How very British. Miss Dorrell hesitated, then reached into her reticule and drew out a page, creased and handled many times. It bore Edwin's handwriting. "Caroline, should anything happen to me, look in the ledger beneath the floorboards of the old library. Do not trust Sir Hector. Do not tell anyone what you find until you are safely away." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Ah, now we begin." He folded the page carefully, tucked it into his coat, and stood. "Miss Dorrell, you have done precisely what was needed. You have brought reason into what others might have dismissed as tragedy." She nodded gravely. "What now?" "Now," Holmes said, eyes gleaming, "we inspect the old library and pray it has floorboards." We waited until the house quieted for the evening and, with the aid of a discreet candle, made our way to the far wing, where Sir Hector's library sprawled like a relic from another age. Dust hung in the air. Holmes moved with a silent precision, testing the floor with his cane until a hollow note betrayed a loosened board near the hearth. With a swift motion, he pried it up and extracted a thick leather ledger. Its pages, bound in cracked vellum, were filled with handwritten entries. Lists of payments, names, dates, and something more troubling still. "Watson," Holmes whispered, "this is no ledger. It is a map of debts, and not monetary alone, favors, blackmail, pressure points, a record of everyone Sir Hector holds in his grasp." My breath caught. "Do you think Edwin found this?" "I have no doubt, and I believe that is precisely why he ended up beneath that bridge, though I'll wager he never reached it of his own accord." Just then, a floorboard creaked behind us. Holmes rose slowly, the ledger still in hand. "I suggest you step into the light, whoever you are. You may yet survive this night with your reputation intact." From the shadows, a figure emerged, and I recognized the man who had poured our wine hours before. The butler, but his eyes held none of the servile deference we'd seen earlier. "Give it to me," he said coldly. "That book belongs to the master." Holmes tilted his head. And what would the master do to protect his secrets, I wonder? Throw another corpse to the river? The man's jaw tightened, but Holmes was already in motion. With a sudden lunge, he knocked over the candlestand and sent the room into chaos. The ledger flew across the carpet as the butler sprang forward. I moved instinctively to intercept, and in the scuffle, heard Holmes' voice ring out, "Watson, the window!" He had already thrown it open, and with strength that surprised me, flung the ledger out into the night. A splash followed moments later, the book lost to the river below. The butler froze. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then Holmes straightened his coat and said coolly, "Well, now, no one owns the truth but the water." And with that, the game had changed again. For a moment, there was only the sound of our breathing and the distant whisper of the river where the ledger had vanished. The butler, his name I would later learn, was Mr. Cade, stood rigid, as though the very loss of that book had snapped something within him. His eyes, cold and calculating, darted toward the window, then to Holmes, and lastly to me. But he made no further move. Holmes, ever calm in the face of threats, reached into his coat and produced a small whistle, which he blew sharply. The shrill note cut through the hush like a knife. Moments later, hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. It was Inspector Lestrade, followed by a uniformed constable. "Good evening, gentlemen," Holmes said as if greeting guests at a salon. "Might I recommend placing this man under arrest? I believe he was moments away from adding Dr. Watson and myself to the Manor's growing list of secrets." Lestrade blinked. "The butler?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "Mr. Cade here just attempted to retrieve a very incriminating document, one he clearly did not wish either Scotland Yard or the Crown to see. Sadly, it now resides at the bottom of the River Grinstead." Lestrade nodded briskly, and Cade was taken into custody without protest. As the constable led him away, Cade cast one last glance back. Not of fear, but of something resembling disappointment. There was no panic, no pleading, just a man who knew his game had failed. Once the hall was quiet, Lestrade turned to Holmes. "What was in the book?" "Enough to suggest Sir Hector has made a career of leveraging people's darkest secrets for his own gain. Names, Watson, dates, quiet ruin, blackmail of the most methodical kind. But I suspect it was Edwin Lavington's discovery of that ledger that sealed his fate. He was not just an interloper in the affairs of the rich. He was a moral man in a house built on silence." "But the ledger's gone now," I said. "What proof remains?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "The truth does not always drown with the evidence, Watson. It merely requires a more careful excavation. And Sir Hector, I suspect, is about to learn just how uncomfortable exposure can be." He turned to Lestrade. "I'd like to speak to Miss Dorrell again, and then I'll need your men to inspect the bridge more thoroughly in the morning. I have a theory regarding Lavington's last movements that may require a reconstruction. But first, let's return to the parlor. There's still a trail of threads to untangle." Miss Dorrell was waiting, as if she had anticipated Holmes's summons. She had changed from her morning attire to something more practical. A travel cloak of deep navy, her hair pinned up with care that suggested readiness for departure rather than grief. Holmes motioned for her to sit. "I've spoken to Lestrade," he said gently. "You may rest assured, Miss Dorrell, that Cade will no longer trouble you. However, I must ask, had Edwin discussed Sir Hector's blackmail operations with you?" She hesitated, then gave a single nod. "Not in detail, but he told me he'd uncovered a kind of ledger, that it wasn't just accounting, it was predatory. He said some of the names might even surprise the courts. He was afraid, Mr. Holmes. I've never seen him afraid before. And yet he stayed. He wanted to confront Sir Hector. He believed he could make him surrender the ledger quietly, without scandal. I told him it was foolish, that men like Hector don't give up power. They bury those who threaten it." Holmes leaned back, eyes narrowed in thought. "And yet you didn't warn anyone." "I had no one to tell who would believe me," she said with a quiet bitterness. "Edwin's word was already under scrutiny in the Manor. Sir Hector claimed he had been drinking, said he was erratic, unstable, trying to frame his employer for imagined crimes. But that wasn't Edwin. He never drank to excess, and he never lied." Holmes nodded slowly. "One more question, Miss Dorrell. On the night of Edwin's death, where were you?" Her eyes met his squarely. "In the village, at the Grey Gull Inn. I left just before 11 to walk to the Manor, but turned back when the fog rolled in. The innkeeper can confirm I returned shortly after midnight. I never saw Edwin again." Holmes tapped his chin. "And yet someone saw him, or rather, saw to him. He didn't fall, he didn't cross the bridge, he never got that far." He stood suddenly. "Come, Watson. There's one last thread I must examine tonight, something that's been nagging at me since we arrived." We returned to the bridge under the cloak of full night. The fog had thickened again, curling low over the stones like smoke from a silent battlefield. Holmes produced a lantern from his satchel and swept its light slowly along the path, then knelt where he had earlier found the button. "This spot," he murmured. "Notice anything?" I crouched beside him. "There's no rail here." "Exactly. This is the section of the bridge that had been repaired, but too neatly, too recently. The mortar hasn't even fully cured." He scraped a fingernail along the stone. The original stone was removed, likely thrown into the river, but look closer. In the light of the lantern, I saw a series of faint scratches running diagonally along the lip of the bridge wall. "Claw marks?" I asked. "Fingernails," Holmes said softly. "Lavington didn't fall. He was pushed, and he tried to hold on." He rose, brushing off his knees. "Cade may have done the pushing, or he may have merely cleaned up, but he wasn't alone. There's something deeper here, Watson. Something still in motion." We returned to the Manor in silence. Back in our guest quarters, Holmes paced restlessly while I poured us both a nightcap. "You're not sleeping, are you?" I asked. He shook his head. "Number, not tonight. There's a pattern forming, subtle, deliberate, cruel. Someone else walked the grounds that night, someone Cade was protecting. I intend to find out who." I watched him for a moment, his figure lean, almost spectral in the firelight, as if drawn in smoke and driven by the pure force of intellect. This was Holmes at his most formidable, not in triumph, but in pursuit. As the hour passed midnight and the Manor creaked into uneasy slumber, I knew one thing with certainty. The river might hold its secrets, but Sherlock Holmes was already halfway to retrieving them. By the time first light crept over the mists of Brierbank, the Manor had settled into a hush that was neither peace nor calm, but a kind of watchful silence. Holmes had not slept. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring toward the direction of the river, which now shimmered faintly under the morning haze. He turned to me with the air of a man who had been circling a solution all night and now found himself staring it squarely in the face. "Watson," he said, "there's a concept in chess I have long admired. Zugzwang. A position in which every possible move makes your situation worse. That, I suspect, is the state of Sir Hector Blackbriar." I raised an eyebrow, still gathering my senses from a night of uneasy rest. "And what move will he make next?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "None, if I can help it. But that depends on the truth we extract today." He was already lacing his boots and shrugging on his coat before I had time to speak again. We met Lestrade at the foot of the stairs, where the inspector awaited us, looking unusually alert for so early an hour. "I had Cade questioned last night," Lestrade said as we descended into the Manor's lower hall. "He's stubborn, but not a fanatic. Claimed he knew Lavington was meddling in matters beyond his station and that he acted only to retrieve the ledger. Claims ignorance of the death itself." Holmes gave a dry smile. "A servant who lies for his master does so because he believes it serves his interest or because he fears what happens if he doesn't. The real question is what Sir Hector has over him." "I was planning to press that very point," Lestrade muttered. "No need," Holmes replied. "Let me handle Sir Hector. But first, gather the house guests, all of them. There's something I wish to observe before our host has a chance to orchestrate another illusion." Within the hour, the drawing room was filled with a curious assortment of figures, ladies in shawls, gentlemen in half-fastened waistcoats, some yawning, others stiff with tension. Miss Dorrell stood near the window, her face unreadable. Holmes entered last, accompanied by Sir Hector himself, who seemed faintly amused by the impromptu assembly. "Mr. Holmes," Sir Hector said with a dry chuckle, "if I didn't know better, I'd think you were preparing a performance." "In a sense, I am," Holmes replied evenly. "I'm reconstructing a crime, one that occurred not here in the drawing room but outside, on the path to the bridge. You see, a man was killed under the pretense of an accident. But accidents don't leave fingernail scratches on stone, nor do they prompt butlers to recover incriminating ledgers." A hush fell. Sir Hector gave no sign of alarm, but I could sense the stillness behind his eyes, like a card player holding a poor hand and waiting to bluff. Holmes continued. "Last night I came to a realization. Cade was complicit, yes, but not alone. The killing was too neat, too calculated. He lacks the finesse for such precision." He turned to the assembled guests. "One of you, perhaps more than one, was party to the events of that night, and to identify who, I need only ask a simple question. Who knew that Edwin Lavington was going to walk alone to the bridge at that hour?" The room remained still. No one answered. Holmes let the silence stretch uncomfortably long before he moved to the center of the room. Miss Dorrell was in the village. Cade remained within the servants' quarters until summoned. The only ones who could have known were those still awake after 11, and those who overheard a conversation. "May I suggest, Sir Hector, that you shared a final brandy with our unfortunate solicitor that evening, one in which he told you he intended to leave your employ, and why?" Sir Hector's expression did not flicker. "I also suspect," Holmes added, "that a third person was present. Someone who heard Lavington's intentions and realized what discovery of the ledger might mean, not just for Sir Hector, but for them personally." At this, Holmes fixed his gaze on a tall, ruddy-faced man I had scarcely noticed before. He was introduced earlier as Colonel Everest, a former associate of Sir Hector from his colonial days. The colonel's hands clenched faintly behind his back. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Colonel Everest arrived at the Manor a fortnight ago. Coincidentally, that is when Lavington made his first notes about something troubling. Everest has no connection to Sir Hector's current estate matters. Yet he has lingered, ostensibly for hunting. I suspect what he's really been hunting is leverage." Colonel Everest bristled. "That's outrageous." "No," Holmes cut in. "What's outrageous is that Edwin Lavington died not because of a quarrel, but because he posed a threat to both of your reputations. I believe Sir Hector may have given tacit approval, but it was you, Colonel, who waited near the bridge. And when Edwin approached, perhaps still unsure whether to go public, you offered to walk with him, then shoved him over the edge at the precise spot where the railing had already been loosened. Cade arrived moments later to remove any physical trace, except for one button. There was a long pause. Then Miss Dorrell spoke. "Sir, Hector," she said quietly, "you told me Edwin was unstable, that he spoke nonsense. You looked me in the eye and lied." Sir Hector offered a faint sigh, as if wearied. "Miss Dorrell, Edwin was a bright man, too bright perhaps, but he threatened a system that had kept many people safe. The names in that book were not all guilty. Some were victims, trapped by their own indiscretions. Exposure would have destroyed lives, not just mine." Lestrade stepped forward. "And did you sanction murder to maintain your web of secrets, Sir Hector?" The old man looked up with something almost like pride. "Number Y merely kept the house warm for men like Everest. That was my mistake." Holmes turned sharply. "A convenient absolution. You maintained the scaffolding and washed your hands of the bricks. That ledger may be gone, but Miss Dorrell has a copy. Don't you, miss?" She nodded slowly, reaching into her cloak and producing a smaller, handwritten version of the ledger's most damning pages. Holmes smiled faintly. "You see, gentlemen, truth once glimpsed rarely dies quietly." With evidence in hand, Lestrade began issuing instructions. Colonel Everest was detained. Sir Hector, for the time being, was placed under house arrest pending a full inquiry. The guests were dismissed, one by one, until only Holmes, Miss Dorrell, and I remained in the quiet of the now somber parlour. Holmes offered her the slightest of bows. "Your foresight saved this case, Miss Dorrell. Without your copy, all would have come to naught." She looked down at the bundle in her hands. "Edwin always said truth is like a bridge. It must be walked, even if it leads nowhere." Holmes's eyes flickered. A bridge no one crossed, and yet everyone feared. We left the manor as the morning light scattered the mist, revealing the river below, calm and glassy once more. But Holmes did not look back at it. Instead, he lit his pipe and said quietly, "It is not the depth of the water that drowns a man, Watson. It is the weight he carries." And with that, we walked on. By the time we reached the Grinstead station, the fog had receded enough to unveil the full breadth of the countryside. Grey skies above, brittle grass below, and the river cutting a dark ribbon through the middle like some old scar. Holmes was quieter than usual as we waited for the train back to London, his eyes flicking absently between the timetable and the distant tree line, as if expecting the trees themselves to yield a final clue. I watched him a while before breaking the silence. "You don't believe it's over, do you?" Holmes didn't look at me. "A solution may satisfy the courts, Watson, but rarely the conscience. Colonel Everest will be convicted, yes. Miss Dorrell's ledger copy will ensure Sir Hector's disgrace, if not imprisonment. But somewhere in the gaps, there are still loose ends, questions left unanswered, and I dislike unanswered questions. Such as, Holmes finally turned. Such as how Cade learned the precise location of the ledger. Edwin had hidden it beneath a floorboard in the old library. Cleverly enough. He only mentioned the hiding place in a note given to Miss Dorrell. Cade claimed he was searching Edwin's room and discovered a chain, but that's not enough to deduce the ledger's whereabouts. I thought a moment. You're suggesting Cade had help? I'm suggesting Cade was directed. Holmes fell into his familiar silence again as we boarded the train. The compartment was mercifully empty, the windows fogged by the chill, muffling the sounds of the wheels clattering along the rails. I lit a cigarette while Holmes stared through the misted pane. Sir Hector was a tactician, Watson. Subtlety was his art. He may not have ordered a killing, but he built the structure within which a killing became inevitable. He let men like Everest think their actions were solutions, not crimes. That ledger wasn't merely a tool of blackmail. It was a map of leverage. The problem is, once maps are made, others always want to read them. And now the map is lost to the river. Not quite, Holmes replied, with that glimmer of amusement that always preceded one of his more unsettling observations. I tossed the ledger, yes. But before I did, I photographed key pages. Cade didn't see that part, nor did Lestrade. I blinked. You, Holmes, that's evidence. It's protection, he corrected. There are names in that ledger, some of which may reach farther than we imagined. Cade may have acted out of loyalty, but someone else may yet act out of desperation. I intend to know who and why. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope, sealed and marked with nothing but the letter B. I sent a copy of the prints to a trusted contact. Should anything happen to me, this will be released to the press. I frowned. Holmes, do you think it's truly that dangerous? I think we've kicked a hornet's nest, and I think not all the hornets have shown themselves. The remainder of our journey passed in pensive quiet. We arrived in London just before noon, and though I expected Holmes would wish to return to Baker Street and retreat into violin and Turkish tobacco, he surprised me by requesting a detour to Lincoln's Inn. As we walked through the busy legal district, Holmes explained, Edwin Lavington worked for the firm of Hewitt, Graham and Twice, a reputable practice but one that handles several estate portfolios in the countryside, including Brierbanks. Inside the high-walled building, the offices smelled of parchment and polish. A clerk directed us to a Mr. Basil Twice, a portly, harried man with watery eyes and an expression like curdled milk. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Twice, I require access to the estate documents Mr. Lavington was managing prior to his death, particularly any pertaining to the financial restructuring of Sir Hector Blackbriar's properties. Twice blanched. I'm not sure that would be appropriate without the firm's senior partner. Holmes leaned in, voice low and deliberate. Mr. Twice, a man is dead. His fiancée nearly joined him, and within the past 24 hours, Scotland Yard has detained a decorated military officer on charges of murder and conspiracy. If you would prefer that this matter be escalated publicly, I am more than prepared to oblige. Twice paled further, then with a resigned sigh, gestured toward a locked cabinet. The files are there. Please, be discreet. We spent the better part of an hour reviewing the ledgers. Most were routine, tenancy records, tax declarations, property valuations, but buried within the archives was one slim folder stamped "Confidential, do not duplicate." Holmes opened it and quickly sifted through the pages. Then he stopped. This, he murmured, holding up a contract with a scrawled signature, is not Edwin's handwriting. I leaned in. But it's dated only 2 days before his death. Precisely. And look here, this clause binds the estate's co-trustee to assume control in the event of Edwin's incapacity or death. That trustee is Basil Twice. We both turned toward the door, but the clerk was long gone. Holmes stood sharply. So Cade wasn't acting alone. Twice had the legal acumen and access to manipulate Edwin's death for financial gain. The killing may have been Everest's hand, but it was Twice's pen that made it profitable. Can we prove it? We will, Holmes said. But we'll need a trap. We returned to Baker Street and prepared a ruse. Holmes dictated a letter to Lestrade, inviting Twice to a private reconciliation of documents regarding the Brierbank estate. The meeting would occur that evening, and Twice, believing he had silenced all opposition, would no doubt attend to finalize the cover-up. That night, the trap was sprung. In a quiet room above a solicitor's office, Holmes, Lestrade, and I waited as Twice entered, nervously clutching a case of documents. When Holmes confronted him with the forged signature and the clause, Twice broke in less than 5 minutes. His confession was quiet, bitter. I didn't know Everest would kill him. I thought Lavington would disappear, that Cade would scare him, or that the scandal would drive him off. But Everest, he did what men like him always do when threatened. He slumped in his chair. And now my career's in the river with your damn ledger. On the contrary, Holmes said, it's sitting in a safety deposit box in Marylebone. Twice looked up, startled, but it was too late. By midnight, the case was complete. Everest would stand trial. Twice would be charged with conspiracy and fraud. Sir Hector, disgraced and likely to follow, had quietly vacated Brierbank for a private retreat. Only Miss Doyle, steadfast and dignified, remained untouched by the stench of corruption, her grief now tempered by justice. Back at Baker Street, Holmes finally collapsed into his armchair, exhausted. I poured us each a brandy. You were right, I said. It wasn't over. Holmes gave a wan smile. Evil Watson often hides behind law, but when law forgets conscience, men like Edwin Lavington remind us of what must be protected. He raised his glass in a silent toast. I joined him. Outside, London hummed as ever, indifferent to justice, unaware that a bridge no one crossed had revealed far more than it concealed. Morning returned to Baker Street in the form of pale grey light spilling through the windows and a gentle patter of rain tapping the glass. London's constant percussion. Holmes had scarcely moved from his chair since our late return the night before. The brandy remained untouched at his elbow, and his gaze fixed steadily on the hearth, though the fire had long since burned down to a cradle of red embers. He hadn't spoken in hours. I placed the morning paper on the side table. Its headline announced, "Colonel Everest held in solicitor's death. Legal clerk confesses to conspiracy." The article recounted the case as the Yard wished the public to know it. A tale of ambition, secrets, and justice, neatly wrapped in legal consequence. But Holmes, I knew, was not yet at peace. "There's still something, isn't there?" I said gently. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Yes, Watson. We have the hand that pushed, the mind that profited, and the house that sheltered it. But what we don't have is the spark, the moment of transformation. Edwin Lavington was a cautious man. He knew the risks. What, I wonder, finally pushed him to act? What convinced him to copy that ledger, to challenge Hector Blackbriar's empire? You believe he was persuaded? I believe, Holmes said slowly, that someone else was involved. Someone we've overlooked. Someone who isn't in the police reports because they've never been in the spotlight. Before I could press further, Mrs. Hudson entered with the post. Holmes barely glanced at the stack, until she handed him a small envelope, square-cut and sealed with green wax. He opened it and read silently, then passed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, you've come far, but not far enough. Edwin wasn't acting alone, and he wasn't the only one who died for that ledger. If you want the truth, come to the Sundial Room at the King's Folly Club. Midnight. Come alone." There was no signature. Holmes rose at once. "Watson, fetch your revolver." "You're not going alone?" He gave a faint smile. "Certainly not. But it's best they believe I am." The King's Folly Club was one of those half-forgotten institutions that straddled the line between decadence and irrelevance. Once fashionable among colonial officers, it had fallen into shadowy prestige, frequented now by gamblers, aging aristocrats, and those who preferred their intrigues veiled in cigar smoke and velvet. Its facade was unremarkable, brownstone with ivy curling around wrought iron lanterns, but Holmes insisted we arrive early, concealed in the alley across the street. At 5 minutes to midnight, Holmes stepped out alone, his silhouette sharp under the gaslight. He walked to the club's door and disappeared within. I waited in the shadows, heart thudding. Holmes had given strict instructions. Wait 10 minutes. If he had not returned by then, I was to enter through the service entrance with my weapon drawn. The minutes crawled. Inside, Holmes passed through the plush vestibule, his name apparently known, for no one challenged his entry. The sundial room was at the rear of the building, past a row of oak-paneled lounges and curtained alcoves. He entered the room. It was circular, windowless, and dimly lit by a single brass chandelier. At its center stood a marble sundial, decorative and functionless under artificial light. A figure waited in the far corner, hooded, seated. "I came," Holmes said calmly. The figure looked up. A woman. She pulled back the hood. "Miss Doyle." Holmes did not blink. "You sent the note?" "Yes," she said, standing. "Because I couldn't let it end like that." Holmes studied her closely. "Go on." She walked to the sundial, resting her fingers on its cold surface. Edwin was never going to act. He wanted to, but fear held him back. It was me who pushed him. Holmes said nothing. "I copied the ledger," she continued, her voice steady, "and I told him I'd leave if he didn't expose it. I told him people like Sir Hector built kingdoms on silence, and that unless someone shouted, the silence would grow. Edwin wasn't murdered because he found the ledger. He was murdered because he told someone else about it." She looked up. "He told me, and then I told others. I passed copies to 2 journalists, so one is already dead. The other vanished a week ago." Holmes' expression darkened. "You believe Sir Hector is responsible?" She shook her head. "Number someone higher, someone who used Sir Hector the same way Hector used others. I don't know who they are. Only that when Edwin died, I received a warning, and then the club began watching me." Holmes glanced around the room. "This club?" "Yes. King's Folly is more than a gambling house. It's a gate. Behind it are names from that ledger who can't afford exposure. They monitor threats. They erase them." Holmes took a slow breath. "Why bring me here?" "Because I know I won't last long. But if I can pass it to you, it doesn't end with me." From within her cloak, she drew a folded bundle, a second set of notes, handwritten, dense with names and figures. "I wrote these from memory," she said. "The journalists' copies are gone. This is the last." Holmes took the bundle with care, slipping it into his inner coat pocket. "You've placed yourself in great danger," he said. She gave a faint, tired smile. "So did Edwin." The door creaked open behind them. Holmes turned sharply. 2 men in dark coats entered, moving with deliberate calm. They bore the unmistakable look of men who had done violence before and would do so again without hesitation. Miss Doyle paled. Holmes stepped forward. "If you're here to stop the truth, I suggest you remember, I've already sent a copy. If you harm either of us, what comes next won't be erasure. It'll be exposure." The taller of the 2 men paused, considering, then he stepped aside. "Leave," he said. "Now." Holmes did not wait. He took Miss Doyle by the arm, guiding her swiftly past the men and through the club's maze-like corridors. At the far end, a side exit spilled them into the wet alley. I was already running toward them, revolver drawn. Holmes raised a hand. "Safe, for now." We hailed a cab and returned to Baker Street in silence, save for the rattling of wheels on wet stone. Inside, Holmes secured the bundle in his desk, then turned to Miss Doyle. "You cannot stay in London." "I know. I'll arrange for you to disappear. A name, a passport, a place where the ledger holds no weight." She nodded, exhausted. "And what will you do?" Holmes poured a single brandy. "I'll wait. The men behind this, sooner or later, they'll make a mistake. And when they do," he looked down at the glass, "I'll be ready." The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, London remained vast, indifferent, and unknowingly a little less silent than it had been the night before. The days that followed passed in a tense blur, each moment laden with the sense that unseen eyes tracked our every move. Miss Doyle had vanished, as arranged, a quiet departure through the back streets, a false name, a distant county manor as refuge. Holmes bore the weight of her absence with rare solemnity, returning to his usual habits with a new edge of urgency. The ledger's contents remained locked away in his possession, an explosive cache of secrets that threatened to shake London's underworld to its core. But as Holmes predicted, the enemies who lurked in the shadows were no longer content with quiet intimidation. The subtle games of blackmail and betrayal had escalated into outright menace. One evening, as rain beat steadily against the window panes of 221B, a sharp knock at the door interrupted our study. Holmes opened it cautiously, revealing a young courier, soaking and breathless, clutching a sealed envelope addressed to him in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Holmes broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. His eyes flicked across the page, sharp and unreadable. After a long pause, he handed the note to me. "If you value life, release the ledger. Failure to comply will result in Miss Dorrell's death. You have 48 hours. I saw the faintest flicker of something I rarely witnessed in Holmes, an almost imperceptible tremor of uncertainty. "We must move swiftly," he said, already rising. "Lestrade must be informed. This is no longer merely a game of secrets. It's a contest of survival." Lestrade was quick to act, coordinating discreet patrols around the city and bolstering security at key locations. Yet Holmes, ever the strategist, insisted on a different course. "We will not hand over the ledger," he said firmly. "That would be surrender. Instead, we set a trap." He detailed a plan with the precision of a master tactician. Holmes would feign capitulation, arranging a meeting with the blackmailers under the guise of negotiation. Meanwhile, I was to accompany Lestrade to secure Miss Dorrell's safety and gather intelligence on her whereabouts. The night of the rendezvous was thick with London fog, the city cloaked in cold and whispering secrets. Holmes and I met briefly in Baker Street, our eyes reflecting the gravity of what lay ahead. "You will have your revolver," Holmes said, pressing it into my hand. "But trust not only in firearms. Use your wits, Watson." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle firmly upon my shoulders. Holmes slipped away into the fog while I made my way to a safe house where Miss Dorrell was being guarded. To my relief, she was unharmed, though the strain of the past days had etched fine lines around her eyes. "I feared they would come for me," she admitted softly. "But you and Mr. Holmes have given me hope." As we spoke, Lestrade received word from an informant. The blackmailers had arranged to meet Holmes in a derelict warehouse near the docks, an isolated place chosen to minimize witnesses. I relayed this to Miss Dorrell, who grasped my hand with unexpected strength. "Be careful," she said. Meanwhile, Holmes approached the warehouse with deliberate calm, his coat pulled tight against the biting wind. The gas lamps flickered, casting long shadows against the peeling brick and rusted metal doors. Inside, figures emerged from the gloom, 3 men, all bearing the hard edges of professional menace. Their leader, a tall, gaunt man with cold gray eyes, stepped forward. "So you bring the ledger," he said, voice low and icy. "Good. Hand it over, and Miss Dorrell will be spared." Holmes smiled thinly. "I'm afraid I don't negotiate with threats, but I am always willing to entertain a reasonable offer." The men exchanged wary glances. From my hidden vantage point, I watched the tension mount like a coiled spring. Suddenly, Holmes gave a subtle signal, the flick of his hand, and Lestrade and his men burst through the side entrance, revolvers drawn. A brief but fierce struggle ensued. Holmes moved with the fluid precision of a master chess player, anticipating every strike, every retreat. One man was subdued quickly. Another tried to flee but was caught by Lestrade's well-aimed shot to the leg. The leader, however, remained composed, his eyes locking onto Holmes with a mixture of fury and respect. "You're clever, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but this isn't over." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Neither is justice, I assure you." As the blackmailers were bound and taken into custody, Holmes turned to me with a rare smile. "Watson, the ledger is safe. Miss Dorrell is safe. For now." But as we walked back through the misty streets, I could not shake the feeling that the city had grown darker still, and that the true mastermind behind the ledger's shadows had yet to step from the veil. Holmes, however, was already plotting the next move, his mind a labyrinth of logic and resolve. The case of the bridge no one crossed was far from closed. The arrest of the blackmailers was only the first stroke on a far larger canvas, and Holmes understood this with his customary clarity. Though the trio's capture brought a measure of relief to the tangled web of deceit surrounding Brierbank Manor, the shadow that loomed over the ledger, and overall connected to it, remained dauntingly vast. That night, as rain once again pattered against the windows of 221B Baker Street, Holmes sat brooding by the fire, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the ledger's leather cover. The men we detained were but instruments, he mused quietly. Their strings pulled by a hand, both subtle and ruthless, one that does not yet wish to reveal itself. I sat nearby, nursing a cup of tea, troubled by the dark implication in Holmes's words. You think the true mastermind remains free? Not only free, Watson, but watching, always watching. The ledger's revelations strike at the very heart of London's underbelly, a man so entrenched in power that even the law trembles at his name. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the fierce light of the hunt. But every fortress has a weak point, and every tyrant makes a mistake. The next morning brought a summons from Lestrade, a coded message indicating a potential breakthrough in the case. We met at Scotland Yard, where Lestrade's normally jovial face was marked by exhaustion and concern. Holmes, Watson, he began without preamble. One of our detained blackmailers has agreed to talk. His name is Higgins. He's been more cooperative since the arrest. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Excellent. What has he revealed? Not much at first, Lestrade admitted. But this morning he gave us a name, Mr. Bellamy, a name none of us have encountered before. Apparently, Bellamy is the puppeteer behind the ledger. Holmes nodded slowly. Bellamy, a cipher we must decode. That afternoon we visited the grim cell where Higgins awaited. The man was gaunt, eyes shifting nervously as Holmes entered. Mr. Higgins, Holmes said gently, your cooperation could hasten your release. Higgins swallowed hard. I don't want to die in a cell, Mr. Holmes. Bellamy, he's dangerous, has eyes everywhere, but I'll tell you what, I know. He leaned forward, voice a whisper. Bellamy's not a name you'll find in directories or society pages. He operates through proxies, trusts few and fears fewer. The ledger's secrets are his currency. Sir Hector was a small piece of his empire, and Colonel Everest another. Where can we find him? I asked. Higgins shook his head. I don't know exactly, but he's been seen at a private club called the Ivy Gate. Exclusive, secretive, even for London standards. Holmes's eyes glinted. A fitting place for a man who thrives in shadows. We secured permission for a discreet investigation. The Ivy Gate was a jewel nestled within a cluster of ancient townhouses on Piccadilly, a club whose polished veneer belied its reputation as a haunt for the city's most influential and secretive figures. Holmes and I arrived one evening under the cover of dusk, presenting ourselves as interested members. The staff, well versed in discretion, welcomed us with polite nods but little warmth. Inside, the club was opulent. Dark wood panels, heavy velvet drapes, and the low murmur of voices steeped in privilege. We navigated through a labyrinth of rooms until we reached the heart of the establishment, a private lounge guarded by an imposing doorman. Holmes flashed a card engraved with the Ivy Gate's crest. A silent nod granted us entry. Inside, the room was suffused with cigar smoke and muted conversation. At its center sat a man whose presence commanded immediate attention, a tall figure cloaked in shadow, his face half hidden beneath a broad-brimmed hat. Holmes approached without hesitation, his voice low but firm. Mr. Bellamy, I presume. The man looked up slowly, eyes sharp as a hawk's. And you must be the persistent Mr. Holmes, I've heard you're quite adept at unraveling puzzles. Holmes smiled thinly. I find that no puzzle is too intricate if approached with patience and reason. Bellamy stood, removing his hat to reveal a face marked by the subtle scars of time and experience. I admire your spirit, but you tread dangerous waters. The ledger is more than names and debts. It's the foundation of a fragile balance. Disrupt it, and chaos follows. Holmes met his gaze unwavering. Chaos is the consequence of silence. I intend to restore balance through truth. Bellamy's lips curled into a sardonic grin. Then we are at an impasse. Suddenly, the room's atmosphere shifted. From the shadows emerged several figures, well-dressed, expressionless, the Ivy Gate's enforcers. Holmes's eyes flicked toward an exit. It appears, Watson, we must act swiftly. Before I could react, Bellamy's men advanced. Holmes pushed me behind a heavy oak table as the first attack came. The scuffle was brutal but brief. Holmes's agility and precision held the assailants at bay until a sudden commotion near the doorway drew our attention. Lestrade and a team of officers stormed the room, weapons drawn. "Scotland Yard!" Lestrade shouted. "Freeze!" Bellamy and his cohorts hesitated, then surrendered, their plan thwarted by the timely arrival of the law. As Bellamy was escorted away in handcuffs, Holmes turned to me with a satisfied smile. The kingpin has finally been unmasked. The next day saw the unraveling of Bellamy's network, extortion rings dismantled, corrupt officials exposed, and the ledger's secrets brought to light. Yet Holmes remained contemplative. "Power, Watson," he said one evening as we sat by the fire, "is a delicate thing, built on silence, fear, and calculated obedience. But it is also fragile, susceptible to the steady drip of truth." I nodded. And it took the courage of a man like Edwin Lavington and a woman like Caroline Dorrell to ignite that drip. Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed, the bridge no one crossed was more than stone and mortar. It was the threshold between fear and revelation. Crossing it demands more than bravery. It demands justice. As the city moved on, unaware of the battle fought in its shadows, I reflected on the case's final lesson. That truth, once uncovered, has the power to shake even the most impenetrable foundations, and that, as always, was Sherlock Holmes's greatest triumph. The arrest of Bellamy and the subsequent dismantling of his network brought a semblance of closure to the tangled affairs that had begun on that fog-laden night at Brierbank Manor. Yet, as is often the case with such cases, the aftermath was hardly a neat conclusion, but rather a quiet breathing space before the next chapter opened. Days later, I found Holmes immersed in the ledger's last pages, his brow furrowed in a way that bespoke both satisfaction and lingering doubt. The room was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, lined with books and curiosities from distant lands. "Watson," Holmes began without looking up, "there is a subtle inconsistency here that troubles me, something so slight it might escape a less trained eye." I leaned forward, curious. "What is it?" He tapped a specific entry in the ledger with a slender finger. "The dates of certain payments attributed to one MC do not correspond to any known events within the timeline of the other entries. Yet the amounts involved suggest a person of significant influence, one who has managed to evade scrutiny." I took the ledger and examined the entries. Could this be a clerical error? Holmes shook his head. "Unlikely. The ledger was kept with meticulous care. No mistakes in the names or figures elsewhere. This discrepancy is deliberate." His eyes glinted. "Watson, I believe MC is the final piece of the puzzle, the puppet master who pulled even Bellamy's strings, and I intend to find out who he or she is." Our search began anew, this time focusing on subtle clues and whispered connections rather than overt threats. Holmes's network of informants and contacts was invaluable, sending tidings from across London's underworld and high society alike. Names and faces emerged, bankers, politicians, even members of the aristocracy, each with potential ties to the ledger and the shadow dealings it concealed. One evening, a discreet letter arrived at Baker Street bearing only a simple signature, M.C. It contained an invitation to meet at a small, obscure bookshop nestled in a narrow lane off Fleet Street. Holmes, ever the skeptic, regarded the note with wary amusement. A meeting with a shadow. This promises to be either enlightening or perilous. We arrived at the bookshop under cover of twilight. The shop was a cramped, dusty place, its shelves packed with tomes that seemed to have not seen daylight for decades. A bell tinkled softly as Holmes pushed open the door. Inside stood a woman, tall and poised, with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her attire was simple but elegant. "Mr. Holmes," she said smoothly, "I've been expecting you." "Ms. Carlton, I presume?" Holmes replied, his voice measured. "You are MC?" She nodded, a slight smile playing at her lips. "I am, and I am the final architect of the ledger's web. But I am not its villain, Mr. Holmes. I am its curator." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "Explain yourself." Miss Carlton gestured toward a small table. "The ledger was never meant to be a tool of destruction. It was a ledger of debts, financial, social, moral, a means to balance the scales in a city rife with corruption and secrecy. I created it to protect the vulnerable by holding the powerful accountable in a way the law could not. And yet it bred blackmail, murder, fear." She sighed. "Yes, the ledger's power corrupted some, twisted the original intent. Bellamy sought to exploit it, as did others. But I sought to keep it safe, to use it as leverage to reform, not ruin." Holmes considered her carefully. "And what of Edwin Lavington? Of Miss Dorrell?" "They were idealists," she said softly. "Bright lights in a dark world. They threatened to expose the ledger recklessly. I could not allow that." "Meaning you ordered their deaths?" "Number Y merely withdrew protection. I did not anticipate the violence that would follow." A long silence hung between us. Holmes finally spoke. "Your vision is noble, but the means have been fatal. Such power must be tempered with transparency, or it becomes tyranny." Miss Carlton's smile faded. "Perhaps. But in London's shadows, transparency is a luxury few can afford." The conversation was interrupted by the sudden creak of the shop's door. Two men entered, faces stern and unsmiling, detectives sent by Lestrade to ensure Holmes's safety. Miss Carlton nodded politely. "I expected you might not trust me, but I will cooperate fully with the authorities. The ledger will be surrendered, and the truth will come to light, on terms that ensure justice, not vengeance." Holmes inclined his head. "Very well. But let it be known, the bridge no one crossed is now open, and all who traversed it will answer for their steps." As we left the bookshop, the night air felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. The city, still vast and unknowable, seemed just a little less shadowed. Back at Baker Street, I reflected on the journey, how a simple drowning had unraveled a labyrinth of secrets and exposed the fragile line between justice and corruption. Holmes smiled wistfully. "Every case leaves its mark, Watson. This one taught me that the greatest mysteries are not always those of crime, but of conscience." I raised my glass in a silent toast. And so, the bridge no one crossed has finally been crossed, with consequences far beyond the ripple of a single stone thrown into a dark river. Holmes exhaled softly, the glow from the fireplace reflecting in his thoughtful eyes. "And as always," he added, "the game is never truly over." The days following our meeting with Miss Carlton passed under a veil of cautious optimism. The surrender of the ledger to Scotland Yard promised an end to the shadowy power it once wielded over London's elite. Yet Holmes, ever vigilant, remained uneasy. He confided in me during a rare moment of quiet at Baker Street, his eyes restless behind the haze of pipe smoke. "Watson, while Miss Carleton's cooperation marks progress, I suspect the ledger was but a single thread in a far more intricate tapestry. The ledger's exposure may compel others, those yet unknown, to move in the dark, preserving their secrets through means more elusive." I nodded, understanding the subtle warning. The city's undercurrents were never fully subdued. New currents could always arise. One evening, a letter arrived with no postmark. Inside was a single card, embossed with a curious emblem, a serpent coiled around a dagger. On its reverse, a message in elegant script: "Justice is a mirror. Beware what you reflect." Holmes studied the card with deliberate care. An invitation, or a threat, perhaps. We set out to trace its origins, leading us to an inconspicuous establishment tucked away in a narrow alley off Fleet Street. It was a dimly lit club known simply as the Mirror Room, famed for its discreet clientele and whispered dealings. Upon entering, the atmosphere thickened. Mirrors adorned the walls, reflecting candlelight into 1,000 flickering shards, and conversations hushed as Holmes and I made our way to a private chamber. There, a figure awaited, a woman whose sharp eyes and poised demeanor matched the calculated grace of the card's sender. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she greeted, voice smooth as silk. "I am Madame Selene. I represent interests that prefer to remain in the shadows. But I assure you, our goals align more than you realize." Holmes inclined his head cautiously. "Proceed." Madame Selene explained that with the ledger's fall, a vacuum had formed in London's clandestine power structures. Various factions vied to fill the void, each more ruthless than the last. She claimed her group sought stability, a balance between justice and secrecy to prevent chaos. "I propose a truce," she said, "an alliance. To root out those who would exploit this moment to sow disorder." Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. "An intriguing proposition. But trust, once broken, is not easily repaired." She smiled enigmatically. "Nor is it necessary. Only cooperation." Over the following days, Holmes and I worked alongside Madame Selene's associates, uncovering networks of influence stretching into government offices and private enterprises. The case evolved from a singular mystery into a vast web of intrigue. Yet, as we probed deeper, new dangers surfaced, anonymous warnings, attempts to compromise our inquiries, and a chilling sense that our every move was anticipated. One evening, while reviewing reports, Holmes suddenly stiffened. "Watson," he said, voice low, "the mirror reflects not just what is, but what we fear. I fear we have underestimated our adversaries." Just then, a soft knock announced the arrival of Lestrade, who carried urgent news. A key witness, vital to dismantling a newly discovered ring of corruption, had vanished without a trace. Holmes's gaze darkened. "The game is far from over, Watson. The bridge no one crossed has become a gateway, and those who once lurked beneath it now seek to emerge." The chase resumed, through London's fogged alleys, grand estates and shadowed chambers, each step revealing deeper layers of deceit and danger. Through it all, Holmes's resolve never wavered, his mind a beacon in the murk. And as the city slept uneasily beneath the weight of secrets old and new, I knew the truth. Like the bridge itself, demanded crossing again and again, for justice to endure beyond the night. The disappearance of the key witness struck like a thunderclap through the ranks of Scotland Yard. Lestrade's normally assured demeanor bore the strain of uncertainty as he briefed Holmes and me at Baker Street. The missing individual, a clerk named Samuel Price, had been slated to provide testimony that could unravel yet another layer of the shadowed network we had uncovered. Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes piercing as ever. Watson, the abduction of Price is no mere coincidence. It is a calculated move, designed to obstruct justice and protect those who still wield influence in the city's underbelly. I nodded grimly. Do we have any leads? Lestrade spread a map of London on the table, marked with red pins indicating known locations of illicit activity connected to the ledger's aftermath. He was last seen near the docks, close to a warehouse that was recently shuttered. Witnesses say he was approached by two men in dark coats. Holmes's expression hardened. The docks, a fitting place for shadows to gather. We must act swiftly. Watson, prepare yourself. We leave at once. The streets of London were slick with rain as we made our way toward the waterfront. The fog lay thick, swallowing gas lamps and muffling footsteps. The docks, with their labyrinth of warehouses and creaking cranes, had an eerie stillness, as if the city itself held its breath. Holmes led us down a narrow alley to a dilapidated building whose windows were boarded and its door hanging askew. A faint light flickered inside. "Stay close," Holmes whispered, producing a small revolver. We slipped inside, greeted by the dank smell of salt and rot. The interior was a maze of crates and shadows. Voices echoed faintly, gruff, cautious. Holmes signaled us to halt. Peering around a corner, I saw two men bound to chairs, their faces bruised and pale. Between them sat a younger man, blindfolded and trembling. "Samuel Price," Holmes murmured. He stepped forward, clearing his throat loudly. The men snapped to attention, drawing pistols. "Put down your weapons," Holmes commanded, voice unwavering. A tense standoff ensued. Lestrade and I moved swiftly, disarming one assailant while Holmes engaged the other in a tense parley. "Why abduct Price?" Holmes asked. The man spat. "Orders from above. Too much is at stake." Holmes's gaze was cold. Justice does not bend to threats. Suddenly, the blindfolded man lunged, knocking a pistol aside. Chaos erupted. Gunshots cracked. Crates toppled. In the melee, we subdued the attackers and freed Price. Outside, the rain masked our escape as Holmes hailed a cab. Back at Baker Street, Price revealed what he had learned during his captivity, a secret ledger within the ledger, detailing covert payments and blackmail aimed at politicians, judges, even high-ranking officers. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The rot runs deeper than we imagined. The next days were a whirlwind of interviews, stakeouts, and covert meetings. Holmes's keen intellect and Price's insider knowledge formed a formidable alliance. One by one, we traced the strings back to a figure known only as the Chancellor, a shadowy power broker whose name surfaced whispered in the corridors of Westminster. It became clear that exposing this individual would shake the very foundations of the British establishment. Holmes, ever cautious, devised a plan to draw the Chancellor out. We leaked selective information, watched for reactions, and waited for the inevitable move. Then, a breakthrough. A coded message intercepted by Price's contacts, arranging a clandestine meeting at a secluded estate outside London. Holmes, Lestrade, Price, and I prepared to confront the final adversary. As we traveled through the darkening countryside, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily upon us. The estate was a grand manor, imposing and serene, masking the storms within. Inside, we found the Chancellor, a man of calm, authority, and icy resolve. He spoke with quiet menace, admitting to orchestrating the ledger's concealment to maintain order, his actions justified by a belief that the ends outweighed the means. Holmes countered, "Order built on secrets and fear is a house of cards. When the wind of truth blows, it collapses." A tense negotiation ensued, but the Chancellor's grip on power was slipping. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the prospect of exposure, he yielded. London breathed anew. In the aftermath, as the city slowly emerged from its shadowed chapter, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, our reflections heavy but hopeful. "Watson," Holmes said, lighting his pipe, "the bridge no one crossed was not merely a place, but a symbol, a threshold between silence and speech, concealment and revelation." He looked out the window toward the fog-wreathed streets, and though many bridges remain untraveled, today we crossed one, a victory not just of deduction, but of courage. I raised my glass in quiet salute. Holmes smiled faintly. "The game continues, my friend. But for now, justice has found its voice." In the days that followed the Chancellor's capitulation, London's pulse began to steady. The shadow that had long suffocated its halls of power and whispered through its darkest alleys had receded, at least for the moment. Yet Holmes and I both knew that such peace was a fragile truce in a city woven with secrets. The ledger, once a symbol of silent control, was now a testament to the enduring tension between light and shadow. One mist-laden afternoon, as I was arranging my medical case in Baker Street, Holmes entered with an unusual energy, a restless fire kindling in his eyes. He placed a folded sheet of paper on the desk before me, the handwriting elegant but hurried. "Watson, it appears our bridge may yet cast longer shadows," he said. "An anonymous letter arrived this morning. It suggests that though the ledger's influence wanes, a new player seeks to claim its remnants." I unfolded the letter carefully. It read, "The ledger's last pages are not yet turned. Beware the spider's web. The strands reach beyond what you have uncovered." Holmes's gaze was steady. The spider's web. A new metaphor for old dangers. It suggests a network more complex than any ledger, one woven with threads that ensnare and strangle unseen. Curiosity and caution intertwined in his voice. "We must discover who this new entity is and what game they play." Our inquiries led us once more into London's undercurrents, tracing rumors and half-truths whispered in taverns, clubs, and back rooms. Holmes's contacts proved invaluable, revealing a pattern of strategic moves that hinted at a hidden puppet master, a figure adept at manipulation and secrecy. One evening, a tip brought us to a secluded townhouse in Mayfair, where a discreet gathering was rumored to occur. Holmes and I observed from the shadows as figures emerged, diplomats, financiers, and socialites, each playing their part in the grand dance of influence. Within, we glimpsed a man whose bearing was regal, his expression inscrutable. He was known only as Mr. Blackthorne, a name that echoed with both respect and fear. Holmes whispered, "The spider's web is his creation, a web that entangles the city's most powerful and vulnerable alike. Our challenge now was to untangle this web without becoming ensnared ourselves." Over weeks, Holmes and I pieced together fragments of Blackthorne's operations, clandestine meetings, illicit financial dealings, and a cadre of loyal agents embedded across institutions. The ledger had been but one thread. Blackthorne's network was a living organism, adaptable and deadly. A breakthrough came when a young clerk, frightened and repentant, sought out Holmes. She revealed details of a secret ledger kept by Blackthorne, one that catalogued debts, favors, and threats more intricate than any before. Holmes's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose. "Watson, this is a new kind of puzzle, one requiring both patience and precision. The spider's web must be dismantled, strand by strand." We orchestrated a careful plan, leveraging Price's insights and our own discoveries. With Lestrade's reluctant but necessary assistance, we began a campaign of surveillance and subtle disruption. Our efforts culminated in a daring infiltration of Blackthorne's inner sanctum, a luxurious estate masked by artifice and guarded with ruthless efficiency. Inside, we found evidence of manipulation reaching into the highest echelons of power. Blackthorne himself, however, was elusive, always one step ahead, a ghost in the machinery. The final confrontation was as much psychological as physical. Holmes engaged Blackthorne in a battle of wits and wills, unraveling his motives and exposing the fragile underpinnings of his empire. Blackthorne's downfall came not through force, but through the exposure of his vulnerabilities, the debts owed to him by those he sought to control, and the quiet betrayals within his ranks. As Blackthorne's network crumbled, Holmes turned to me with a mixture of relief and reflection. The ledger was a map of debts, Watson. The spider's web was a labyrinth of power. Both demonstrate the same truth. Control built on fear is destined to collapse. We returned to Baker Street as dawn broke, the city awash with new light. Holmes lit his pipe, exhaling a slow plume of smoke. The bridge no one crossed was merely the beginning. London is a city of many bridges. Some crossed, some not, each with its own story, its own peril. I nodded, feeling the weight of our journey settle into quiet resolve. And the game? Holmes smiled faintly. The game, my dear Watson, is eternal, but for today, justice has found a foothold. The rest will follow. As the sun rose over the Thames, bathing the city in golden hues, I understood that in London, mysteries never truly end. They only wait for the next crossing. The dawn that broke over London carried with it a brittle clarity, one born not merely of sunlight, but of hard-won truths emerging from long shadows. In the quiet sanctuary of 221B Baker Street, Holmes sat before the dwindling embers of the fire, his gaze distant yet piercing, as though already 2 steps ahead in a game only he fully understood. I settled into my chair opposite him, the ledger now closed and the tangled webs of intrigue largely untangled. The spider's web has been dismantled, Holmes said at last, voice low but resolute. Blackthorne's empire crumbled under the weight of his own hubris and the relentlessness of justice. I nodded, though a lingering unease persisted. Yet it feels as though the true victory lies less in the arrests and exposes, and more in the restoration of something London had lost. Holmes's eyes glimmered with a rare softness. Precisely, Watson. The ledger, the webs, the shadows, they are symptoms of a deeper malaise. Fear of exposure, the corrosive hunger for control, and the silence that enables corruption. He paused, then unfolded a single sheet of paper he had taken from the ledger's final pages. A carefully written note, unsigned but unmistakably penned by Miss Carleton. Let the ledger be a lesson, not a legacy. The bridge once untraveled is now crossed, and with it comes the imperative to walk new paths. Paths of transparency, accountability, and courage. Holmes set the paper down and looked directly at me. Our work illuminated the dark corners, Watson, but it also illuminated the necessity of vigilance and integrity. For every shadow dispelled, another may rise. I took a breath, the weight of our journey settling into a profound respect, not just for the resolution of the case, but for the enduring spirit that drove Holmes's pursuit. As ever, the game continues, I said quietly. Holmes smiled, the familiar spark of genius lighting his features. Indeed, my friend. And though the bridge no one crossed now stands behind us, countless others await passage, each a mystery, each a challenge. He rose and moved to the window, gazing out over the awakening city, the fog lifting, the streets stirring, the heart of London beating steady once more. In the end, Watson, he said softly, the greatest deduction is that justice is not a destination but a journey, one that requires courage to cross the bridges others fear. I raised my glass in silent toast to the city beyond, to the mysteries that awaited, and to the indomitable mind beside me. And with that, the case of the bridge no one crossed came to a close, its echoes lingering in the mists, a testament to truth, resilience, and the eternal dance between darkness and light.